So these were the first steps I used to tackling Hank's reactivity. Understand why he's doing and what he's doing, introducing communication, introducing obedience and loose lead walking, and introducing him to scatter feeding. The next step was to start tackling the actual reactivity and the frustration in the outside world, and starting to change the way Hank feels about things. As you can imagine, this can take a while. While we can use punishment to stop him reacting, in the early stages I wanted to try and avoid punishment as much as possible, especially something like a leash correction, as he was already frustrated with dealing with the lead. So the plan was to work on his loose lead walking, building up engagement while keeping him under thresholds. Hopefully he could see a trigger in the distance, far enough away where he doesn't react, then a mark and a reward. Not asking him to do anything, but letting him know that he's doing something right by not reacting. This is the start of changing the way how he feels about the trigger. Dog equals food, not reacting equals food. Now before we saw the trigger, we would start practicing some obedience and engagement to get his focus on us and switch his brain into a bit of a happier mood and a bit less tense. A key here is movement. While forcing a dog to sit and watch a trigger go past can work, in my preferred style of training, I prefer movement. For dogs, movement is motivation. Thanks to their prey drives, chasing things can be hardwired into them, and they get a rush when they are chasing something. That's why Hank loves chasing the ball. We want Hank to follow me. Adding in movement can be a game changer, helping you distracting your dog from their anxiety and making it into a fun game. Fun game means a happier dog. A happier dog means they're less likely to react. Then we can tone it down over time, because eventually we do just want neutrality. But this only works if they know the game. I don't know how to play American football. If you chuck me onto a pitch, I won't understand what's going on, then I'll get tackled by some huge ass dude, and then I'll probably have anxiety next time I go on a football pitch. Not very fun. So that's why we teach the rules in a low distraction environment. Now we just need to rinse and repeat the game over and over and over again, while over time reducing the distraction and increasing the duration to the triggers. We also need neutrality to the world. This is quite simple. By exposing him to the world, taking him to different environments to help build up his confidence, while having a drama-free time. The more successful time he has outside without reacting, the more confident he's going to be, the more he explores, the more he gets used to it. Depending on how Hank was feeling on the day, depends on the location of our walk, the duration, or if we even walked at all. There's one day in particular I started some engagement training with Hank before our walk. He was super hyper, struggling to focus and on a bit of a mad one by how fast he was moving. So I didn't walk him that day. I didn't think it would be a successful walk, he was too amped up. So we channeled that energy into something else by playing games and also just doing some training into it. There's other ways than just walking your dog to get out all of that frustration. Very similar to humans, dogs do get good days and bad days. Overall, the first few days were good with Hank. We made a lot of progress. Even small progress is success when you're working with a reactive dog, and you do need to celebrate those small victories. We were walking nicer, dealing with triggers better, not going threshold as often, but I did have a problem. Now, this is where different trainers have different opinions and the politics come into dog training. Hank's guardian had some goals. The biggest one was being able to walk him nicely with no pulling and no reacting. Eventually just wanting to be able to take her dog to a cafe. Hank's owner is 60 and she has never trained a reactive dog, and she has very little experience with dog training. I started to question if the training I was doing with Hank would be into a transferable state by the time I'm done. The force-free training I was doing with Hank was working, and I'm confident we could have got him to a spot sticking to force-free if we had more time. But he's a difficult dog to manage, especially as we could only do 2 or 3 minutes of lead training before the lead biting kicked in. Over time, we could increase that, but I didn't have too much time. Part of my job is making dog training easy for struggling dog owners. Having to show and explain obedience, leash pressure, desensitization, counter conditioning, threshold, managing, positioning, markers, and then what he does if he does bite the lead, how we train to prevent that by using a long line, swapping leads, redirecting, tug of war. In my opinion, this was too much information for the guardian to be successful to carry on doing. We had 2 days for a handover, and the rest of my time If she needed support, it would be over online as I've moved back to Cambodia. When it comes to dog training, simple is key. The biggest issue I had when dealing with his training was the lead biting. It would drive him up into like this aroused frenzy state, almost always ending our training session. If we could get him to stop the whole lead biting situation, it becomes much simpler for the guardian. And I was thinking about this a lot. How can I approach and fix this issue? If I was able to fix this, then I could extend our training sessions and frequency to do more lead work, which will then transfer over to helping his owner, which will then in turn help Hank as she has less things to worry about. I woke up on day 7 and the answer just hit me straight out. I've got out of bed, and it was over a podcast that I heard a week ago. And it was really simple. Just don't let him. If he was biting the lead, the very simple thing I could do is just not let him. Sometimes the solution is right in front of you, but we overthink it. Because I had a very good relationship with Hank at this point, I decided I would simply not let him bite the lead. If he did, I'd use a correction as he tried to bite it to let him know that this is not okay. The correction wasn't intense or abusive, it was simple and neutral. Hank has never been told no, as well as then receiving a consequence. You can see it's almost like a light bulb moment goes off. He goes, oh, and then we go back to normal training. Now there's a huge stigma around corrections, and I want to make this clear. It does not fix the underlying issue, but it allows us to stop one of the larger problematic behaviours which is causing his arousal to increase, making it harder to keep him under threshold and making it harder to train. The more training I could do, the easier it would be for Hank's guardian, in turn to help Hank. Using corrections can 100% ruin your relationship with a dog if you are using corrections wrong, or rely on an intense amount of punishment in your training. In total, over the 14 days, I gave Hank about 900 rewards, 900 treats of just food. On average, about 64 a day, probably more than that, and about 6 corrections for biting the lead. Now, the additional benefit of Hank learning that biting the lead is bad is we can now start diving more into leash pressure work, teaching Hank if he pulls too much, there's tension on the lead, he can turn it off by coming back. So we're using 2 reinforcers. By coming back and not pulling or sitting down, this also turns off leash pressure. So we have started to change the way Hank interacts with the lead, giving us more options to tackle his reactivity. If we look at our first walk and then compare it to day 8, you can see a pretty big improvement, mainly the lead biting. Good boy, good boy. Yes. Oh, good boy. Yes. Good. I didn't intentionally correct him here. I also thought he was far enough away from the distance. He lunged and hit the end of the line, causing a correction to himself, which isn't ideal, and I could have done that better. But what I do next is more important. A lot of positive reinforcement and rewards for doing the correct thing. I do not think it's fair to punish a dog and then not reward them for doing the right thing. Giving them extra rewards if they're doing the behaviour that you want to see. Then we also saw a second dog very shortly after, and we were still able to work through it without any lead biting, which is huge. Considering he reacted from this far away and went straight into lead biting, he was still able to accept food after this as well, which implies that he wasn't way over threshold. The important thing for me is to use as many rewards as possible, not just on walks. So we kept doing our daily obedience sessions, we kept doing our lead training in the garden, and we kept having fun and playing together as well. We were able to extend our walks and training sessions because he was no longer lead biting. And on day 11, I saw the last 10 days really start paying off. It finally felt like we were in sync, especially when we walked around the corner and there were 2 people with 2 sausage dogs, and this was his reaction. Not perfect by any means, but when you have a reactive dog, every little step in the right direction is a success. This wasn't that intense, and there was no lead biting, and he was able to still listen afterwards. As the days were coming to an end, we started to proof everything. At this point, it's just a whole lot of successful repetition. Playing fetch, using a long line, working around distractions, and keeping him under threshold, giving Hank positive experiences in the outside world, as well as encouraging him to listen to us. On day 13, we were starting to wrap up, and I wanted to do something special for Hank as a reward for how good he's done. So I took him to a field, so he could run and explore and just be a carefree dog. And we only saw one dog on the walk, which was a shame, but he handled it incredibly well. Unfortunately, by the time we got to the field, Hank was exhausted because we've been walking for about 15 to 20 minutes and he's got tiny legs. So all Hank wanted to do was just be pet before coming home. He pulled a bit on the way back, which is absolutely fine. At the start, we could only do a maximum of 15 minutes before the lead biting kicked in, and at most we managed to do was 1 hour on this walk, with no reaction, no lead biting, no lunging or barking. We also took a trip to Starbucks for a puppuccino on that day as well. Now, a few things to talk about with reactivity. First of all, if your dog has suddenly had a big behavior change, medical health check. If your dog is in pain or suffering, this can lead to reactivity or aggression. Second is fulfillment. If your dog is getting all their genetic needs met, it will help massively with any underlying frustration that they are dealing with. Thirdly is diet. We swapped Hank's diet over because he was eating tinned pedigree food, which was pretty much McDonald's for dogs, so we swapped him over to a healthier, more balanced type of kibble. Overall, we were able to start laying down a solid foundation for Hank's guardian to work from. We taught him fetch in case the owner doesn't have time or the energy to walk him that day. We can still burn off some of his energy in a fun, structured way where his needs are still being met, while transferring that into obedience training as well, and even impulse control. He can play tug of war and he can start dropping on command. His impulse control has massively improved. His reactivity is lower and easier to manage. Lead biting is pretty much non-existent, and he can walk nicely on lead while being engaged with his owner. By no means is Hank fixed. He still has a long way to go. But that's something for him and his owner they need to work on together. And all I can do is support them when they need it. Hank is now a much better place that they can work together. I made more detailed videos on days 1 to 5. If you're interested, you can check them out there. I highly recommend checking out day 1 and day 4. I just think they're better videos, had more time to put into them. So a quick update on some of the messages I've received, because it's now been a month after I've left Hank. As I said, his owner's 60, so she does struggle she can't film and walk the dog as well, which is absolutely fine. It's a lot to focus on. They've been going out to do adventure Sundays, so every Sunday they go to a new environment and they can actually enjoy each other's company and just have a good time. So hopefully this helps paint a little bit of a clear picture for you guys in how you can take different steps to help your dog and help reactive dogs.